Aquarius. Something lately may have brushed against you, ever so lightly, not clear, not easy to name, just in those quiet, ordinary moments, when the day is just beginning, or when everything around you seems the same, you suddenly notice the way you feel about things has shifted, just a little. Not a big change, not something that needs to be explained right away. Just what once stayed on your mind for so long doesn't seem to carry the same weight anymore. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, you find yourself wondering, is this coming from you, or from the way everything around you is slowly moving into a different place? Tonight, we're not here to chase a clear answer, just to slow down a little and listen to what might truly be changing. Because if you look a little closer, you may begin to realize something has been quietly different for a long time now. There are changes that don't arrive with sound, no clear signs, no single moment you can point to and say, this is when everything started to shift. It's more like a very thin feeling, light, like early morning mist still resting on a window. You reach out to touch it and realize you're no longer reacting the way you used to. On an ordinary morning, standing alone in a quiet kitchen, your hands moving through familiar routines, pouring coffee, watching the steam rise, hearing the soft clink of a spoon against the cup. Everything looks the same as it always has. And yet, something inside you is no longer standing in the same place, not stronger in any loud, visible way. Not because you've moved on perfectly. Just the things that once held you still for a long time now pass through you a little faster. The thoughts that used to loop in your mind don't return with the same weight, and the emotions you once tried to explain, to fully understand, now seem to exist without needing a clear answer. Maybe you didn't notice it right away, or maybe you did, but chose not to name it just yet, because a part of you understands. Some changes don't need to be confirmed, they only need to be felt. You're still you, still the one who has walked through all of it, and yet, there's a very thin layer within you that has quietly shifted. And it's that subtle shift that changes the way you look back at everything. You might remember an old story, a moment that once stayed with you, and this time, you don't feel yourself being pulled into it. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer holds you there. There's a gentle distance now between you and the things that once felt heavy. Not so far that you forget them, but far enough that they no longer pull you back the same way. And in that space, there's a kind of peace you may not have noticed before. Not something dramatic, not a turning point, just a quiet lightness that's hard to explain. Like stepping outside on a familiar afternoon. The wind still moves the same, the light still falls the way it always has. And yet, you find it a little easier to breathe. Maybe no one else would notice. Even you might hesitate to call it a change. But deep down, you know, something is no longer the same, and what's interesting is you didn't have to do anything to make it happen. It didn't come from trying to control things, or from searching for answers outside yourself. It came from the way you quietly moved through it all, from the times you chose silence instead of reaction, from the moments you accepted that not everything needs to be understood right away. All of it, little by little, has changed you in ways that are almost invisible. And now, as you pause in a very ordinary moment, you begin to feel a subtle shift within yourself. No need to rush and name it, no need to fully understand it. Just notice maybe everything is quietly turning. And as you find yourself standing here, in a place that feels just a little lighter than before, you begin to see things in a very different way. It's no longer about asking who did what, or was it right or wrong. It becomes a deeper feeling that somehow everything is quietly rearranging itself, in its own way, at a pace you don't need to control. You know, life rarely comes back to return something in a clear, exact way. It doesn't move in neat circles where everything falls back into place so you can see the outcome right away. Instead, it feels more like water, flowing quietly, moving through uneven ground, carrying away what needs to go, and leaving behind what no longer fits. No loud noise, no signal demanding your attention. Just, when you look back, you realize the current has changed. There may have been a time when you felt things weren't fair, when something happened that you couldn't quite explain, when someone else's choices left a space inside you that was hard to name, and you tried to understand it, tried to find a reason, tried to organize everything into something you could accept. But then, at some point, you paused, not because you found the answer, but because you realized not everything needs one. And when you stop trying to fix everything, you begin to notice something else. That what happened, whether from misunderstanding, distance, or unfinished choices, wasn't working against you. It was simply unfolding in its own way. And over time, everything seems to find its way back toward a kind of balance. Not the kind you expected, not a return to how things used to be, but each piece slowly settling where it belongs. What is no longer yours gently steps back. What truly fits stays with less effort. And you don't need to push or pull anything anymore. There's a quiet sense of ease in realizing that you don't need to prove who was right or who was wrong. You don't need to define what should have happened, because life doesn't really move in simple lines of right and wrong. It moves through alignment with who you are becoming, alignment with the way you're learning to let go, alignment with what you truly need, not what you once believed you needed. And maybe that's why everything starts to shift, not to return, not to repeat, but to adjust. Gently, slowly, almost no one notices except you. You begin to see the things that once took up so much space no longer do. Old stories don't pull you back the same way, not because they've disappeared, but because they've already played their part. And so have you. You're no longer the person who once stood inside that story. You're standing somewhere else now, a place where things don't need to be fully clear to still feel complete. And in that quiet sense of fullness, you begin to understand in your own way, maybe nothing was ever against you. It was simply finding its way back to its own kind of balance. And then, in a very quiet moment, you begin to notice something you may have never really seen before. The shift you've been feeling didn't necessarily begin out there. It started within you, a long time ago. Not through a big decision, not through a clear declaration, but through the smallest changes, the kind only you would recognize. The way you look back at an old story, without needing to analyze every detail. The way you hear something, without rushing to react. The way you choose silence, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer need to prove anything. There's a quiet depth of maturity in choices like that. Not loud, not something that asks to be seen, but enough to change how you stand in your own world. You're no longer in a place where you have to understand everything, no longer where every feeling needs to be explained, and no longer where someone else's actions can pull you out of your inner balance. You take a step back, just a little, not to avoid, but to see more clearly, and from that gentle distance, things begin to feel lighter. What once had a strong hold on you no longer carries the same weight, not because it changed overnight, but because your connection to it has changed. You don't react out of old patterns anymore. You don't let emotions carry you too far. There's a pause now, brief, but enough to choose, and that pause has changed more than you realize. Maybe no one else notices. Maybe everything outside still looks the same. But within you, a new kind of order is slowly forming, calmer, clearer, less pulled in every direction. And when you shift your position, even just a little, everything around you begins to move differently too. Not because the world changed for you, but because you're no longer meeting it the same way. What once hit you deeply now simply passes through. What once stayed in your mind for so long no longer lingers the same way. Not because it disappeared, but because you're no longer standing where it can reach you that deeply. And this didn't come from trying to become someone else. It came from walking through enough to no longer need to respond the same way. You don't need to harden yourself. You don't need to close yourself off. Just understand a little more clearly what's worth holding on to and what can gently pass. And in that understanding, there's a quiet kind of freedom, a feeling you don't need to explain, you don't need to prove, you just know. You're no longer standing in the same place you once were, and that shift is quietly changing the way the world touches you. And then, in a very ordinary moment, with no warning at all, you notice something, soft, almost quiet. Something is changing. Not a clear conclusion, not something that needs to be confirmed right away. Just a passing feeling, but enough to make you pause. And what's different this time is, you don't feel the need to go back. You don't feel the urge to revisit the entire story, just to check if everything is okay now. You don't feel the need to go through every detail again, to decide what was right, what was wrong, not because you've forgotten. Yeah, and not because it no longer matters, but because you've come to understand some journeys don't need to be analyzed again in order to come to an end. You're no longer searching for the perfect explanation, no longer waiting for a moment where everything becomes completely clear, and you no longer feel the need to prove anything. Not that you were right, not that you tried hard enough, not that you deserved a different ending. Those things once meant a lot to you, but now they don't carry the same meaning anymore. There's a deep kind of quiet that comes when you stop trying to explain yourself. You don't need anyone to fully understand your story. You don't need someone to look back and finally recognize your worth the way you once hoped they would. Because you understand now, validation from the outside is no longer what holds you steady. You've moved beyond the place where every feeling needs a response, where every effort needs to be seen, where every hurt needs an explanation. Now, you begin to keep more for yourself, not as a way of closing off, but as a way of choosing what truly needs to be shared, choosing what can remain in quiet. And within that quiet choosing, you don't feel like something is missing. You don't need to go back to confirm that you're okay. You don't need a sign from the outside to know you're on the right path. You just need to feel the peace within yourself. A very simple kind of peace, not loud, not something that asks to be explained. From the outside, it may seem like not much has changed. But within you, something has gently come to a close. Not like a door slamming shut, not like a final decision, but like a door softly closing, and you're no longer standing on that side of it. You don't need to go back. You don't need to look back. You don't need to carry what's already passed just to prove that it once mattered, because you know it has already fulfilled its purpose, and so have you. You've walked through it. You've learned. You've changed in ways that aren't always easy to see, and maybe this is what real change feels like. Not when everything outside shifts, but when you no longer need to go back looking for something within it. A very quiet state, steady, and enough to let you keep moving forward, lighter and more true to who you are. And then, as you look back on this entire journey, you may begin to notice something very different from what you once expected. There isn't a clear result you can hold on to. No single moment big enough to call an ending. No complete answer for everything that happened. And yet, what remains is something you may not have expected at all. A feeling, very light, very real, and very still. You begin to realize your heart doesn't feel as heavy anymore. The thoughts that once kept circling no longer repeat in the same way. The things that once held you still for so long now simply pass by, like a soft breeze. Not because you forgot, not because they never mattered, but because you moved through them as fully as you could. And when something has been lived through deep enough, it no longer needs to stay just to be understood. There's a new kind of quiet within you now. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of fullness. You don't rush to fill it anymore with thoughts, with questions, with assumptions. You let it be there, gently, naturally, and in that quiet space, you begin to feel a kind of peace you may have once thought was far away. Not the kind of peace that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from no longer needing things to be perfect. You don't need to name what has shifted. You don't need to define exactly what changed or when it changed. You only need to feel that you are standing in a different place now, a place where your mind isn't as loud, A place where you can breathe a little deeper without trying. A place where you begin to trust, not the outcome, but the path you've already walked. Or, and maybe, this is how life has always worked, not through big turning points that everyone can see, but through the smallest shifts, just enough for the one living it to feel. No noise, no clear sign, but enough for you to know. Everything has been rearranged in a different way, a way that fits who you are now, a way that feels lighter to your heart, a way that feels more true to you. And when you see that, you no longer need to go back and compare where you once were, because you know you've already come much farther than the place you once stood. If you're still here, listening, maybe you're feeling something too, something quiet, something personal. No need to rush to understand it, no need to name it, just allow yourself to stay with that feeling a little longer. And if this journey has touched you in any way, you can leave a small sign, something simple. I feel the shift. Sometimes, just acknowledging that is already a way of gently moving forward, and maybe what you've been searching for was never ahead of you or behind you, but right here, in the quiet sense of peace you've just begun to feel.